Good morning. We're having a seminar today, and it's a very important topic of short guard syndrome, or otherwise known as intestinal failure. So, this is a very important topic for theory exam and maybe in some word round scenario. So, we'll have three speakers today. The first speaker will be Dr. Omkar Nath, who will be presenting on the etiology and pathophysiology of short bowel syndrome. Okay. So, Dr. Omkar Nath is second year DNB resident at MR Bangalore Hospital. So, Omkar, please come. Sir.
Good morning, sir, teachers, seniors, and my dear friends. Myself, Dr. Omkar Nath, DNB PGT second year from MR Bangalore Hospital. Here to present seminar on the topic cause and pathophysiology of the metabolic changes in short bowel syndrome. First of all, coming to the definition of short bowel syndrome, it is a clinical condition in which there is inadequate length of the functional intestine to sustain normal internal nutrition as a result of massive small bowel dissection. Or it could be defined in another way as intractable diarrhea with impaired absorption of the nutrients following resection or bypass of small intestine, ultimately leading to the progressive malnutrition. All these cases seen mostly seen when remaining small intestine length is less than 150 centimeter, or when small intestinal dissection is more than 75%. And could be seen in other condition also, which will be discussed later. Clinical presentation of small bowel syndrome depends on the site and extent of dissection. Up to 50% resection, there is no permanent deleterious effect. But if there is extensive resection, lots of metabolic and nutritional consequences occur. Now coming to the etiology of the small bowel syndrome. It 75% it is mostly due to massive intestinal dissection. Could be due to the mesenteric vascular thrombosis, Crohn's disease, radiation enteritis, malignancy, trauma in the adult, and in pediatric cases, intestinal dissection could be due to necrotizing enterocolitis, intestinal atresia, intussusception, meconium ileus, and gastroschisis. In Crohn's, most common cause of small bowel syndrome is Crohn's disease, dissection due to Crohn's disease, and in children, it is necrotizing enterocolitis. Now, coming to the clinical hallmark of small bowel syndrome, it is tried, that is diarrhea, fluid and electrolyte imbalance, and malnutrition. Diarrhea, most common cause is due to the mortality is increased, which led to the gut motility is increased, and there is the absorption of fat in the colon, which led to the colonic mucosa, which also led to the more fluid and electrolyte absorption, less fluid and electrolyte absorption in the colon, leading to diarrhea. And cause of malnutrition is due to there is decrease in the pH, which led to inactivity of the digestive enzymes, leading to malnutrition, leading to disturbance in the absorption of the nutrients, leading to malnutrition. Now coming to the adaptive changes in the retained small bowel. There is villus hypertrophy and hyperplasia, increased absorptive surface area, increased crypt depth, there is intestinal dilation, and lower transit time of the bowel contents. Factors determining the outcome of small bowel syndrome. First, age. Infant tolerate massive resection better than the adults. Retained ileum and ileocecal valve showed better outcome. Delayed clearance of the gastric cause hyperacidity and peptic ulcer. And also depends on the adaptability of the small bowel. Adaptation is better if ileum is preserved. Proximal small bowel dissection is tolerated better than distal small bowel dissection. Because proximal small bowel dissection, like if there is a resection of the jejunum, then there is very minute changes in the outcome, because function is taken over by the ileum. So very minute changes occur. Now coming to the small bowel physiology. Small bowel motility is 3 times slower in ileum than jejunum. Coming to the water absorption, it is 44% in jejunum, 70% in ileum, and 90% in colon. Sodium absorption is in jejunum is 13%, in ileum it is 72%, and in colon it is 90%. So we can see that ileum is critical in the conservation of fluid and electrolytes. Now there are various sites for the absorption of the nutrients and other things. Like iron absorption is most commonly seen in duodenum. Most macronutrients and minerals absorption occurs in jejunum. And ileum is the only site of absorption for vitamin B12 and bile salts. And colon is most commonly the site of absorption of the water and electrolytes. Now, effect of resection. If there is resection of jejunum, then there is no significant alteration in the fluid and electrolytes. There is no effect on absorption of nutrients because ileum taking over the function of the jejunum after some time. Only in the initial stage, some changes seen, and after some time, ileum taking over the function of jejunum. So no significant alteration is seen. Greatest proportion of digestive enzymes are concentrated in villi of jejunum. So there is initial reduction in the absorption of nutrients until adaptation by the ileum. Now, if there is resection of ileum, then there is increase in the gastric motility. There is acceleration of intestinal transit time, with both leading to the diarrhea, and there is loss of bile salt, which could lead to the fat malabsorption and steatorrhea. If there is more than 100 centimeter distal ileum dissection occurs, then it leads to diarrhea and steatorrhea. There could be deficiency of vitamin A, D, fat soluble vitamin, that is A, D, E, and K, due to loss of bile salts. And there could be, so patient is told to take told to restrict their fat intake and require regular parenteral vitamin B12. On ileocecal valve resection, there is reduced intestinal transit time. There could be diarrhea and leading to the increased risk of bacterial overgrowth. In colon, there is more than 90% absorption of water and sodium ion. So patient with intact colon, it is relatively protected from the effect of massive small bowel dissection. But if there is more than 2 centimeter small intestinal resection occurs with colectomy, then patient will have jejunostomy. In this case, we have two situations, two patients that one is net absorber and other is net secretor. In net absorber, there is more than 100 centimeter of residual jejunum. In this case, there is more absorption of water and sodium ion from diet, and patient is managed without supplementary parenteral food. And we have net secretor. In this case, there is less than 100 centimeter of residual jejunum. Patient lose more water and sodium from their stoma and require supplementary parenteral food. Patient is advised to take less amount of oral hypotonic solution like water, tea, juice, and encouraged to take hypotonic saline, hypotonic fluid, and like glucose, and saline replacement solution which have sodium ion concentration of at least 90 millimole per liter. Some patients with 50 to 100 centimeter of small small intestine, and intact colon need long-term parenteral nutrition, while all patients with 50 centimeter or less of jejunum anastomosis to an intact colon require parenteral nutrition. Most patients with less than 200 centimeter of small intestine ending in jejunostomy require regular infusion of fluid and electrolyte, while all patients with less than 100 centimeter of small intestine ending in jejunostomy require long-term parenteral nutrition. Thank you.
Onkar has given some idea about the consequences and the etiology of this short bowel syndrome. But actually, if you go to the detailed aspect of this short gut syndrome, you have mentioned, but you have not classified these types of short gut syndrome. One you said is a situation that whole of ileum and colon is resected. That means the patient is ending in a jejunostomy. That is one situation. Second situation is there is massive gut resection where major part of small gut is removed with less than 100 centimeters jejunum being retained, and that is anastomed to the colon. Yes. And another is there is good amount of gut resection, but terminal ileum is retained and colon is retained. So there are three broad groups of patient where you have no ileum and the colon. Second is you have good amount of jejunum and the colon intact. And third is large gut is intact and you have done a massive resection of small gut. So in these three groups, the pathophysiology varies. Because you said that colon has an important role for water and fluid absorption. And colon is a site for conversion of some nutrients like oxalic acid. If the colon is intact, it will cause oxaluria. And you have not mentioned about the phases of this small syndrome. The phases are, yes, that is very important. When you talk of pathophysiology, you should touch these important points. When the gut resection occurs, the immediate phase of operation to 4 weeks is a phase we call as acute phase, where patient has maximum changes. Patient has gross electrolyte imbalance, patient has nutritional failure. So that is a phase we call as acute phase. From this acute phase, body tries adapting. So in acute phase, if you see the management, main management acute phase is parenteral nutrition. And then towards the, after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, once the patient settles, you can start having some phase of enteral nutrition. In the adaptation phase, body tries to absorb fluid and the whatever gut is retained, that tries to adjust. And that takes about a year. So 4 weeks, about 1 to 2 years is the time for adaptation. If adaptation is successful, this patient can manage with enteral nutrition or oral nutrition. Or you have done a resection which is critical. The other patient, you can go to chronic intestinal failure. So these are the three important phases of short gut syndrome. One is acute phase, second is adaptation phase, and third is the chronic intestinal failure phase. So in that case, patient will need permanent support. And you have not touched upon the other consequences. Once you have this patient having short gut syndrome, the pathophysiology should also touch effect on other organs. Like the other patient who can have chronic liver disease, which is described as intestinal failure associated liver disease. This patient may have chronic kidney disease, intestinal failure associated kidney disease. The other patient who can have some other metabolic changes. So this pathophysiology should have covered these aspect of short bowel syndrome, because you have mentioned about this, that there is some difference when the colon is retained, but there are distinct groups of patients. These are, in fact, I find a paper where they are classified this into type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 is ending jejunostomy, type 2 is jejunum to colon, and type 3 is the major part of anatomy is retained, but there is massive resection. And based on this, the pathology will change. Okay, so these are the different aspects of etiology. Etiology, see, one is surgical. You remove the gut. Second is, apart from the gut removal, there are some situations where the gut is there, but it is non-functional, like Crohn's disease, other inflammatory bowel disease, non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia. So there are a lot of other conditions where even if the gut is not moved surgically, the gut becomes non-functional. And there are some consequences, because you see, the treatment will depend on the etiology. How this is being happening in the body, your drugs and surgery will alter that pathophysiological change. So what happens in these patients, once the gut is resected, there is a feedback from small gut to the stomach. The enteroglucagon reduces the gastric secretion. Once the small gut feedback is lost, there will be gastric hypersecretion. Okay? Once there is gastric hypersecretion, there is more fluid is being shown into the small gut. So one cause of diarrhea is gastric hypersecretion. Another cause of diarrhea is reduction of absorptive surface. And third is some hormonal changes, which increase the intestinal transit time. So diarrhea is multifactorial, because these etiological factors of diarrhea will be taken into consideration when you treat the patient. That means you have to treat the gastric hypersecretion. You need higher doses of PPI. Okay, so this pathophysiology is very important to understand the subsequent changes. Okay. Okay, thank you, Omkar. The next speaker will be Dr. Malvika she's a second-year engineer resident at Apollo Hospitals. So Malvika will present about the complications and investigations. Dr. Malvika, you can start.
Good morning, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'll start the investigations and complications that we do for short bowel syndrome. Next slide. Yeah. For blood investigations, you will get a complete hemogram of the patient, albumin and pre-albumin if it's feasible in the setup, to establish the nutritional status, pre-existing nutritional status of the patient. We will check for liver function tests, because there is often like liver function derangement with earlier in the phase there will be increase in SGOT, SGPT, but later on after 2 weeks or so we find elevated bilirubin and alkaline phosphatase due to chronic lack of enteral intake. We check serum urea and creatinine levels to check for kidney function, because the patient may firstly go be a CKD patient with pre-existing malnutrition, and also to assess there will be increase in creatinine levels. Serum electrolytes will need to be checked, because there is metabolic imbalances like hypophosphatemia, hypomagnesemia, hypokalemia. Serum, I forgot to mention on the slide, but glucose levels, because there will be initial hyperglycemia, and the patient may have complications like hyperglycemic coma, etc. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies, vitamin B12, which is absorbed in the terminal ileum, may be low, and all fat absorbed vitamins like A, D, E, K will be low. Hence, we should estimate it on a regular basis to arterial blood gas examination will require for lactic acid levels, because the known complication is lactic acidosis, the lactic acidosis. So we will need an arterial blood gas estimation. Next slide. For radiological imaging, this is mainly done to assess the extent of the preoperatively extent of the bowel that is damaged, or the cause of the bowel damage. So in neonates and in adults, we can get an X-ray abdomen to assess if there is any distension of the bowel, like in paralytic ileus, prolonged paralytic ileus, or there is volvulus, gastric volvulus, etc. Sonography of the abdomen can also be done. It is also done post surgery to assess for kidneys, if there are any kidney stones, gallbladder stones, and the status of the liver, because these are common complications that are seen, common issues seen post during short bowel syndrome. CT scan of the abdomen can help us in assessing in Crohn's disease, in volvulus, mechanical obstructions, trauma, etc. Even in neonates to assess necrotizing enterocolitis with MRI of the abdomen can be used when we cannot use radiological image, we cannot use radiation. And CT angiography of the superior mesenteric artery to see if there is any thrombotic occlusion of the superior mesenteric artery, which is causing bowel ischemia, hence short bowel syndrome. Specific investigations, liver biopsy to assess liver function, and also upper and lower GI endoscopy we can also use to diagnose Crohn's disease or the extent of Crohn's disease. Now, complications of short bowel syndrome. Immediately following bowel resection or in the acute phase, there will be fluid and electrolyte imbalances like hypokalemia, hypophosphatemia, hypomagnesemia, hyperglycemia. There will be malnutrition, and that is acute enteric failure and intestinal failure. And then catheter-associated complications when the patient requires parenteral feeding. If there will be a central venous line which causes catheter-associated complication, which I will get into later. Delayed complication as in the adaptation phase. There will be bacterial overgrowth due to stasis of the intestine, slowed intestinal transit time. Because of that, there will be bacterial overgrowth in the bowel loops, which can cause cramping and diarrhea, which is treated with oral antibiotics and fluid supplementation. D-lactic acidosis. This is because of the carbohydrate which is in the dilated loops of the bowel gets metabolized by the enteric bacteria and causes lactic acidosis. Patients will present with altered mental status and electrolyte imbalances and extreme respiratory depression, etc. And it's treated with fluids and antibiotics. Nephrolithiasis. This is because of hyperoxaluria. Usually oxalate is bound with calcium and is excreted, but then because of the resected intestine length of intestine, the oxalate gets accumulated and can cause hyperoxaluria and hence nephrolithiasis. Next slide. Long-term complications. Parenteral nutrition associated liver disease is a common complication in patients who require long-term parenteral nutrition. This causes steatosis and can present with liver fibrosis in the later stages. There's also skin breakdown. This is not a very serious complication, but around digitostomy and gastrostomy side. Next slide. Central venous catheter associated complications are because of parenteral nutrition therapy and because of the central venous catheter itself. In the first, we can distribute into mechanical, metabolic, and infectious complications. And based on the time period, the first 48 hours is mechanically based on the insertion of the central venous catheter, all the mechanical complications associated with it, which is malposition, hemothorax, pneumothorax, air embolism, and puncture of the carotid artery and the subclavian artery, which causes bleeding, because excessive bleeding. Metabolic complications like fluid overload, hyperglycemia, hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, hypophosphatemia, refeeding syndrome. also overfeeding, which is later. In the first 2 weeks, we can see mechanical complications like air embolus, occlusion, and thrombosis of the central venous catheter, which is treated with thrombolytic therapies. And metabolic complication, the patient, because of glucose intolerance, goes into hypoglycemic coma. Other electrolyte imbalance, which is similar, like hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, and acid-base imbalance like D-lactic acidosis. In infectious conditions, the catheter can cause sepsis with mostly Staphylococcus and yeast, Candida species. Next. The 3rd month onwards, that is in the chronic phase, can have the fracture of the catheter itself, which is a mechanical complication. Metabolic, we can have parenteral nutrition associated with bone diseases, which is because of hypocalcemia and hypophosphatemia. The parenteral nutrition associated with liver disease, which I mentioned before, and essential fatty acid deficiencies, which causes alopecia, skin changes, and liver dysfunction. And in terms of infectious diseases, we have sepsis because related to the catheter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Malavika, for nice presentation.
Thank you.
Basically, the investigations in short bowel syndrome is it has to start with the clinical evaluation. It's very important that you have to assess why this patient has gone to short bowel syndrome. That means you have to review the patient history and clinical examination. You have to review the patient operative notes, what are the surgery done. And as I said, everything will depend on whether the colon is there or not, whether terminal ileum is there or not, because they are the important sites where more of these intestinal functions are localized. Okay, that is one. Second is you do the lab and radiology investigations. And again, the complications of short bowel syndrome, there are two broad groups. One broad group of complication is short bowel syndrome. Because of the length of the short bowel syndrome, there are some complications. As I said, gastric hypersecretion, increased intestinal transit, malabsorption, fluid retrieval deficiency. So intestinal failure because of the short bowel syndrome. And this failure of short gut function leads to some other systemic consequences. You have mentioned that patient has got chronic liver disease. Patient may have nephrolithiasis. The patient, why this patient develop gallstones? What is the cause of increased incidence of gallstones in patient has got short bowel syndrome?
Because cholecystokinin is usually secreted in the jejunum, and because of if there is resected jejunum, then cholecystokinin will not be secreted and causes concentration of bile.
Multifactorial, you see, developing this gallstone disease in short bowel syndrome is multifactorial. One is, as you said, cholecystokinin is absent, so gallbladder become less functional. You are giving the patient parenteral nutrition. The gallbladder is not contracting, so there is stasis of bile there. Second is, if you have resected the terminal ileum, there is less absorption of bile salts. So there is a imbalance of bile salts and cholesterol phospholipids in bile, leading to a lithogenic bile. So these factors, patient has got lithogenic bile, patient has got bile stasis because of failure of small gut function, and sepsis is another condition. Here the patient who has got chronic overgrowth of bacterial flora in the small gut. So all three factors are conducive for development of gallstone disease. And in fact, there are recommendations that this patient may undergo prophylactic cholecystectomy. If you feel this patient is going to have small gut failure and patient will have long-term malnutrition, people are recommending that you can do even prophylactic cholecystectomy because they have a very high incidence of gallstone disease. And most of the patients, you will find that patients who are being candidates for small gut transplantation, people are doing composite transplantation with even liver transplant. So that is a sequence of change. The liver changes are sequential. It starts with steatosis. It goes to fibrosis, and then it can go into the end-stage liver disease. So these are the patient who can have various phases of liver dysfunction to the extent of chronic liver failure, end-stage liver disease.
Okay.
So these are the different complications, and then the parenteral nutrition acid complications. Because most of the patients who has got a situation of a chronic intestinal failure in the third phase, they have to be on long-term parenteral nutrition, which is now known as home parenteral nutrition. So these are the patient who has got all the consequences of parenteral nutrition. One is catheter-associated complications and the metabolic syndromes.
Yes.
Okay, so we have given a good idea about this, but we should have more classifying this and describing. So we have covered everything. Okay, so these are the situations that you need to investigate these patients, and we should keep in mind the complications, because this will be the basis for our next presentation on management of Short-Gut syndrome. So Dr. Milind Alokji will present on how to manage a patient of Short-Gut syndrome. Thank you, Malvika.
Good morning, respected teachers. I'm Dr. Milind Alokji, and I'll be covering the topic short bowel syndrome, its management. Now, before going on to the management, there is a short overview of some scenarios that we must look at, and I've tried to, in a very brief, encapsulate that in this table. Now, depending on the part intact, there are multiple scenarios, and the management of them also changes. Firstly, if the colon is intact. Now, colon has a very important feature that it absorbs fluids and electrolytes and a modest amount of nutrient energy also. So the outcome is that if the colon is present, the patient might be relatively protected from the effects of a massive short bowel resection. But it is very important to see that what is attached along with the intact colon. So if there is about 100 to 200 centimeters of jejunum attached, then the macronutrient fluid and electrolyte level is maintained, but there will be deficiency of fat soluble and vitamin B12. And so oral nutritional supplement along with trace elements and vitamins and minerals can be given. But if within intact colon you have 50 to 100 centimeters of small intestine, some of these patients will require long-term parenteral nutrition. But if the length of the small intestine intact is less than 60 centimeters, although with an intact colon, then most of these patients will require a long-term parenteral nutrition. Long-term parenteral nutrition will also be required for all those patients who the bowel is ending in a jejunostomy and the length of the small intestine is less than 100 centimeters. But those patients where the bowel is ending with the jejunostomy, but the length of the small intestine is greater than 100, less than 200, they can be maintained on regular infusions of parenteral fluid and electrolytes. Among infants with short bowel syndrome, weaning from TPN independence has been achieved with as little as 10 centimeters of residual small intestine. So this is a brief overview of what are the different scenarios in which the different therapies are needed. Now, whenever a patient with short bowel syndrome or intestinal failure comes to us, we have to evaluate the patient, and many of these points have in detail been covered by the previous speaker. These patients come with a very complicated and a very long chronic history. And so a very systematic and a detailed approach has to be taken. A thorough review and summary of the past medical record and a confirmation of the previous diagnosis must be done. The cause of the short bowel syndrome, the anatomy, length of the intestine, which can be done by the previous endoscopic reports, the upper GI picture series should be done. Then the number of central lines and the reasons why they were changed, the microorganisms in case of central line infections, nutritional assessment including parenteral and enteral intake, daily caloric requirement, macronutrient components of the parenteral nutrition, detailed laboratory investigations, detailed vaccination status, and complete physical examination. Now, complete physical examination should be done, and emphasis should be done on to check the patient's hydration status, nutritional status, and any signs of nutritional deficiencies and complications of parenteral nutrition. So then we come to management. So management is basically of two types, medical and surgical. And initially, we start with the medical management. So the initial treatment, medical management, is the management of the primary condition precipitating the intestinal resection, controlling the diarrhea, and repletion of fluids and electrolytes lost is the severe diarrhea. Now, patients can have volume loss of up to more than 5 liters a day, and thereby vigorous monitoring is very essential. So most patients in this initial phase will definitely require a TPN, and they can be gradually shifted to enteral nutrition, but only once the ileus has resolved. The main aim in all patients of short bowel syndrome should always be to try and shift the patient to enteral nutrition. The mainstay of treatment, medical management, is home parenteral nutrition. Now, home parenteral nutrition along with multiple other drugs are used. Firstly, the first category of drugs which are used are anti-secretory drugs such as histamine antagonists, PPIs, and somatostatin analog octreotide. Now, anti-secretory drugs, they will decrease the secretion from stomach, liver, and pancreas. PPI decrease the acid secretion. What this does in return is, if the amount of acid secretion from the stomach is less, the jejunal output to neutralize this acid secretion will also decrease, and thereby the overall jejunal output will decrease. And octreotide, along with being an anti-secretory agent, also decreases GI motility. Then you have anti-diarrheal agents such as loperamide, drugs to reduce diarrhea related to bile salt malabsorption such as cholestyramine, and you have enteral and parenteral vitamin and trace element supplements. Now, after the acute phase, we have a period of adaptation. Now, the period of adaptation is a time when there is increase in the absorptive capacity of the remaining bowel, and this lasts post-operatively for 1 to 2 days. There are structural and functional changes that take place in the intestine at this point, and this is the time in which there is a titration. The TPN and enteral nutrition should slowly be titrated. The patient should be moved from TPN to enteral nutrition, but there are multiple factors on which this adaptation and how well the patient's bowel will adapt depends. Now, these include the length of the remnant bowel, what kind of bowel is remaining, presence of whether the ileocolic junction is present or not, absence of stoma, absence of liver disease, age of patient. The most important factors are the length of the remnant bowel and the functional state of the patient's bowel, which includes these two factors as shown in the slide. So these are the factors that will help us determine beforehand only whether the adaptation can take place or not. Now, parenteral nutrition was a major breakthrough in the treatment of short bowel syndrome, because before 1968, even patients having massive mesenteric infarction did not used to undergo resection, because IV maintenance, IV nutritional therapy to maintain was not there. So the patients were basically, there was a resection of bowel done only when necrosis was there. So the major complications that these patients went through were repeated surgeries, and death was due to sepsis and organ failure. Now, always prior to initiating the parenteral nutrition, we first must assess whether the patient will have an ability to at least partially have enteral nutritional therapy, and the assessment to determine the ability to establish intestinal and colonic continuity and surgically collect any form of obstruction in order to restore continuity. Only when we can ascertain these two things should we start parenteral nutrition. Also, patient and caregiver should be properly trained and should be capable of executing the plan at home. Now, typical parenteral nutrition formula will contain macronutrients, lipid, amino acids, vitamin, minerals, electrolytes, and fluids. Dextrose is the source of carbohydrates. Lipids mostly provide the essential fatty acids, and water will provide the fluid requirements. Along with that, we add electrolytes, vitamins, and trace elements. Another very important aspect of parenteral nutrition is to ensure an access. In these patients, the vascular access is the lifeline of these patients. So the central venous cannula should be tunneled and placed in the superior vena cava. These catheters ideally should be reserved for parenteral nutrition only and should be single lumen. And those patients who are chronic patients who require IV solutions such as antibiotics and frequent replacement fluids, in those a dual lumen catheter might also benefit. Now, parenteral nutrition comes with its challenges that are expensive, demanding, and patient with a risk of complications. These complications have been covered by the previous speaker. Only a few points on management that I would like to highlight is, in case of catheter-related complications, mostly in another subset of patient, whenever there is an central venous catheter-related infection, the management is to remove the catheter. But in this case, since future vascular access has to be preserved, the first step that we do is start broad spectrum antibiotics and see a response. If within the next 24 to 48 hours the patient worsens, we remove the catheter. If the patient is stable or improving, then we can continue with the same catheter. Also, if a fungal organism is seen in the culture, then we must remove the catheter even earlier. Metabolic changes are very important because these patients have high output ostomies, and therefore it is very important to monitor these patients. Also, metabolic changes lead to something in this patient, that is a silent renal insufficiency is there, because the patient is in a chronically dehydrated state. And blood urea nitrogen and serum creatinine are not important indicators of chronic renal insufficiency, because these patients are mostly sarcopenic. So in this case, it has been seen by some studies that GFR is a better monitor to assess renal insufficiency. Then organ dysfunction, as have already been covered. Now, a small note on intestinal failure associated liver disease, because it is a very well recognized complication of parenteral nutrition in both children and adults. Clinical feature is the presence of jaundice, but it indicates an advanced stage of liver disease. It is defined as a liver function test at 1.5 times the upper limit of the reference range for at least 2 weeks in the absence of another cause. And it is seen that in large proportion of patients, some form of liver injury will always be there. So it is very important to recognize the signs early and adjust the parenteral nutrition formula to reduce the total calories and increase the carbohydrate to lipid ratios, because these diseases will very quickly progress to a decompensated IFLD, and which has a very high mortality rate. Now, next we come to enteral feeding. Enteral feeding should be started as soon as there is recovery from the acute phase. And initially, a high carbohydrate, high protein diet should be started to maximize absorption. Milk products should be avoided. As the gut adapts, the osmolality, volume, and calorie content can be increased. Nutrients should always be given in the simplest form. Simple sugars, dipeptide, tripeptides will be rapidly absorbed. And there should be reduction in dietary fat, but supplementation of diet with at least 100 grams or more of fat with medium chain triglycerides should be done, and because these are mostly absorbed in the proximal bowel. Along with that, vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, calcium, magnesium, zinc supplementation should be provided to provide a holistic feeding to the patient. Now we come to the surgical management. Surgical management is basically of two kinds. There is non-transplant and transplant surgical management. Non-transplant surgical management, the basic principle is to optimize the surface area of the unused intestine. Now, this will improve the intestinal function, increase the nutrient and fluid absorption, and achieve enteral nutrition by two ways. Either it will slow the intestinal transit or it will increase the intestinal length. Now, they have shown some promise in children, but in management of adults, the evidence is still unclear. Before starting a non-transplant surgical management, certain things have to be taken care of. Firstly, all fistula and osteotomies must be closed. Bowel obstruction must be surgically relieved. We should be assessed if the patient has a reasonable chance to achieve independence from parenteral nutrition, and that the remaining bowel length and function will not be better served by transplantation. And bowel tapering and lengthening procedures can be performed. Potential complications are necrosis of the divided segments and anastomotic leak, and patient selection is very important. If the patient has jaundice or has a history of jaundice, it is better to consider patient for transplantation, because lengthening procedures in this case are contraindicated. The patient might already have liver dysfunction or liver disease, and liver transplantation would also benefit. So there are two kinds of operations to slow the intestinal transit and to intestinal lengthening operations. The first category, we have segmental reversal of small bowel, interposition of segments of colon between unused small bowel, between segments of small bowel, construction of small intestinal valves known as nipple valves, and electrical pacing of small intestine. Not much evidence is present about these operations, only few case series and case reports, and we don't know how beneficial they are. More research has been done about the intestinal lengthening operations, such as the Bianchi procedure, which is the longitudinal intestinal lengthening and tailoring, the serial transverse enteroplasty procedure, and the spiral intestinal lengthening and tailoring, that is the SLA. So first, briefly about the Bianchi procedure. It was first described by Bianchi in 1980. And what they basically do is there is separation of the dual vasculature of the small intestine, followed by longitudinal division of the bowel and subsequent isoperistaltic end-to-end anastomosis. What this does is it increases the length and is improved intestinal motility and prolongs the transit time. So it is mainly used for pediatric patients with dilated residual small bowel. Now here is a brief about the Bianchi procedure. Now in the first picture, as you can see that which is not shown, that the dilated segment is removed from the rest of the bowel. Then the mesentery is divided into the two parts with the arterial and the venous supply. Each flank has alternatively the arterial and the venous supply. Then the longitudinal stapler is used, and the bowel is divided into two parts, and then the a lazy S-shaped loop end-to-end anastomosis is done, and then both the ends are again attached to the remaining bowel. Now, next we come to the step procedure. One note about the Bianchi procedure: it is a complicated procedure, and now it is mostly of historical value. It is not very routinely done. Next, we come to serial transverse enteroplasty procedure, or the step procedure. Now, the goal of this procedure is lengthening of the dilated small intestine without the need of separation of the dual vasculature by narrowing the luminal diameter. And the increased bowel distances between the undivided bowel, it increases the transit time. So the dilated segment is narrowed by alternate firing of the GI stapling device when the luminal diameter ranges from 1 centimeter to 2.5 centimeter, which increases the bowel length. And it has been shown that it has achieved enteral autonomy in a few subset of patients. So here, as we can see, the lengthening of the dilated small bowel is accomplished by serial application of intestinal stapling device in the long axis of the intestine. As you can see here, this is a real-time picture of how the bowel looks afterwards, and these are the various ways in which a dilated intestine can be tackled through the step procedure and the Bianchi procedure. Now we come to the surgical management, that is the transplant. It marks a final available theory for a patient with intestinal failure or short bowel syndrome who have generally failed parenteral therapy. Now, indications, there are very specific indications for intestinal transplant. Either the patient is with permanent irreversible short bowel syndrome with one or more life-threatening parenteral nutrition related complications. There is poor prognosis for enteral adaptation. Patient has a poor quality of life, uncontrolled fluid electrolyte disorders while on parenteral nutrition. They have low-grade unresectable malignancies such as GIST and desmoids, and they have pan-portosplenomesenteric venous thrombosis, not amenable to shunting, or isolated liver transplantation should be considered. So there are different kind of grafts. There can be an isolated isolated intestine graft where all a part of the donor jejunum is grafted. And this is for patients with short bowel syndrome only who have a normal foregut and liver function. Liver intestine graft together. Liver intestine graft together, where the graft contains liver, duodenum, pancreas, spleen, jejunum, and the technique for the procurement of this graft is the Omaha technique. This is indicated when patients who have intestinal failure, obviously along with liver failure, or as in the case of IFAD. Then we have something known as the multivisceral graft, where we have the liver intestine graft and we include the stomach in that. This is for diseases where both the foregut and midgut are also involved, mostly for tumors or those diseases affecting the GI motility. There is also something known as the modified multivisceral graft, where you have intestine, stomach, but the liver in these patients are functioning and can function properly later on, and so liver is not transplanted. Very briefly, the recipient operation: we first take vascular access, intra-abdominal exposure, recipient organectomy is done. Firstly, vascular inflow reconstruction is done. If liver is being transplanted, then biliary reconstruction is done. There is restoration of the intestinal continuity. Enteral feeding tube is placed and the abdominal wall is closed. So these are the different kinds of transplants that can be done. The first here, as we can see, is only an intestinal transplant. The second is the liver intestinal type of transplant, and the third is the multivisceral transplant, where the stomach is also involved. Now, the complications of the post-transplant, they can be post-operative complications such as intestinal perforation, mechanical obstruction, anastomotic leak. They are serious life-threatening complications, and re-exploration in every case is not possible. Endoscopic complications are also very common in these patients, because for repeated endoscopy has to be done to check for rejection. This can lead to bleeding, hematoma, perforations. Vascular access related complications, since these patients are not fully weaned off of parenteral nutrition, so those can always happen. And medical complications are rejection, infection, immunosuppression. Short note on rejection: highest rate of rejection in small intestine as compared to all the other organs because of high immunogenicity due to lymphoid tissue, and acute cellular rejection is within the first year after transplant but can occur later. Signs and symptoms: viral gastroenteritis, and therefore due to lack of distinct feature, it is difficult to diagnose it sometimes. Multiple kind of rejection can be there: acute, moderate, and severe. Histologically depends on how much crypt is involved and what level of inflammation is there. The important point is that ileoscopy through the ostomy needs to be done, and routine ileoscopy and biopsy typically beginning between POD 5 and 7, and they should be obtained 1 or twice weekly for the first 1 to 3 months and needed for symptoms thereafter. Liver has a protective effect on the rejection of intestine. Now, there are some pharmacological options that are emerging for the treatment of short bowel syndrome. One is using GLP-2 plus glutamine plus growth hormone with a modified high carbohydrate diet. Now, GLP-2 has been seen as a key mediator of the intestinal adaptation, and as a reduction in 20% less, reduces the PN use by 20% less. Teduglutide is a GLP-2 analog that is resistant to degradation by proteolytic enzyme DPP4, which usually degrades the GLP-2 in the normal intestine, and this is the first targeted therapeutic agent to gain approval for in the case of short bowel syndrome. Now, this is one challenging scenario of net absorbers and net secretors, which my previous speaker has already covered. Only I'll mention only a few points about the treatment. That in case of net secretors, we have to restrict the total amount of hypotonic fluids such as water, tea, juices to less than 1 liters a day, and the intake of glucose and saline replacement solution with sodium concentration of at least 90 millimole. Certain complications of small bowel syndrome have also been covered by previous speakers. Now, outcome: 50 to 70% of patients who initially require TPN ultimately achieve independence from TPN. There is prognosis for enteral autonomy is better among pediatric patients, and patients with end enterostomies and those having less than 50 centimeter of residual small intestine had significantly worse survival than those without these features. Now, very briefly, I just wanted to show a short video about the step procedure. It will not take more time. Here, first they pass a catheter, which helps to guide the stapler where it needs to be placed. After placing the stapler, they ensure that before every firing, they measure all the complete measurement is done.
From the edge.
As you can see, then they fire the stapler, and the gap is created, and then the edge is just and reinforced. And then they move on to the next site and again pass the catheter, and in the end, and this is how finally the intestine will look in case of a step procedure. Thank you.
Yeah. So Milind has given a very good overview of the management. Okay. So he has gone through all the parts of management in the acute phase, the adaptation phase, and the detail about the surgical treatment. In acute phase, in addition to TPN, you have to consider the good fluid electrolyte balance.
Yes, sir.
So you cannot replace 5 liters through TPN. So initially, when you consider most of the patient failure in the acute phase is because of electrolyte imbalance and nutritional failure.
Yes, sir.
So there is a good amount of morbidity, mortality in the acute phase. So in that case, a good fluid management is very important, and you have to keep in mind the losses. Patient has got hypersecretion, patient has got diarrhea, so patient has got all the electrolyte being deficient. And the mainstay of fluid replacement is the correct the fluid electrolyte balance, and then start the patient early TPN. In acute phase, the mainstay of treatment is fluid electrolyte and the nutritional management. And during the adaptation phase comes a period where you should try all these drugs, newer drugs like teduglutide, we can slow the intestinal transit and helps in absorption. And then to adapt, once the intestines start adapting structurally, that is the time that one should switch over from TPN to enteral nutrition. And if this patient can be managed in that part, they are chronic intestinal failure which are manageable. And some patients who are not manageable even with this phase, they are the candidate for some form of surgical treatment. Okay, so you have discussed in details. Any question in the chat box? No.
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you all. Okay.